Hi, I'm Max Walker&Williams, and today I'm at Cambridge University and have the privilege of being with Patrik Alley. Patrik is the co-founder of Global Witness, a charity organisation that shines a bright light in the dark world of global corruption. He's also the author of Very Bad People, a book that was described by the Times as being a clear-eyed view of a world of poison money. It's probably one of the most infuriating, exciting, and somehow hopeful books I've ever read. Patrik, thank you so much for taking the time today. Why are you here in Cambridge?
Every year in early September at Cambridge there is a symposium on economic crime. This is the second time I've been here. And it has brought together loads of a variety of people, but for example the ministers of justice of various countries, attorney generals, lawyers, fraud lawyers, cops, spooks, NGOs like ourselves, all talking about swapping information, getting to know each other, and talking about how better to tackle economic crime, and looking at how economic crime evolves, because it does. Yes, I'm a novice here, really. I was here speaking on a couple of panels.
Right, okay.
And yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And in your experience, does progress happen? Is it just information sharing, or does progress happen at events like this? Or does sort of world leaders and the people in power that may attend an event like this or hear about it, do they just sort of smile, nod and go on with their lives? Or do you think real progress can be made?
The people that I've met here are, for example, in the panel I was just on, one of the questions came from a woman who leads an enforcement, I couldn't tell you exactly what it is, but an enforcement arm of US Customs. And she's very proactive. She wants to catch bad guys. And so she's saying, we have vast resources, we have this many employees, but once something's got to our borders, it's too late. What we need is information before it gets to our borders, in the sense if it's environmental, if something's, illegal timber or something.
A log is too late.
A log is too late. The forest got cut,
Yeah.
But there's lots of people like her who are, prosecutors. They want to prosecute people. So they're very actively talking about different techniques, latest information, but also they're looking for information. There's another guy on my panel, a guy called Ron Sarakan, he's saying, bring me information. I'm a federal prosecutor. I want to prosecute crimes. Give me information, I can do it.
Wow.
So it's actually not just a talk shop.
Right.
And it's also interesting to hear from, the political levels as well, to see the political will, which may not always be genuine, but at least talked about.
Yeah, and at least it is being talked about, at the very least. So can you tell us a little bit about your background, if you wouldn't mind, your sort of childhood and before Global Witness was a thing? Who are you?
Cool, blimey. I don't know if I remember that back that far. My dad was a naval officer. I was brought up on naval bases in my early years. Then we moved to the home county south of London. And I was just an ordinary, moderately underachieving schoolboy, rubbish at sport, and always not very good at dealing with authority. I didn't go to university. It wasn't such an essential thing to do then. And I began working in the construction industry in my early 20s. Supplying construction equipment and that kind of thing. A job I hated from the moment I started it, but by then I had rent or whatever to pay, so I had to keep doing it. And then in sort of the mid-1980s, I was getting increasingly kind of viscerally interested in the environment. It wasn't an intellectual thing. I was watching the film, on TV of Greenpeace on the dinghy between the whale and the harpoon, thinking they're so right in what they're doing. There's nothing you can criticize in what they're doing. They're putting their lives on the line. They're trying to save a whale from, people who don't need to be killing whales. I want to do something like that. And I started volunteering for Greenpeace, just fundraising, shaking a can in the street, that kind of thing, writing letters, please go on Rainbow Warrior. I never got a reply. But eventually in 1989, my long-term relationship broke up. Mutual boredom, I think. We quite liked each other, but anyway.
Yeah.
Sold the house, had a little bit of equity, and I thought, well, I'm going to travel around the world and discover myself. That was the first phase.
Right. Okay. And do you think was it always going to be? Do you think was there a pivotal moment in your life that led you to that path? To say, because a lot of people at the time will have seen the same footage, and they didn't, start exploring the world and go down the path that you did. So what do you think the first step was? How?
I like to be involved in things. I get frustrated if I'm on the periphery of things.
Right.
And so I wanted to be in it. I didn't, fundraising, and I know this because we're an organisation that need funds ourselves, it's an essential part of what we do. Without that, nothing happens. So I'm perfectly happy to fundraise. I still fundraise. But I wanted to be doing. And I think also, actually, this is a pretty critical point, that my father joined the Navy as a midshipman in 1938, before World War II began. And he served all the way through the war. And at the age of 24, he stayed in the Navy, but at the age of 24, he'd been through that. He'd been through World War II, and he loved it. He didn't suffer the things that some people suffered. And I remember thinking in my boring office job, if I have kids and they say to me when I'm 60, "What did you do, Dad?" I went, "Oh, I sat in an office doing this, that, and the other for all of my life." That wasn't going to make me happy. I wanted something to say. I wanted to take on a challenge. I didn't know specifically what it was, but I wanted to be active.
And that, coupled with the wrongdoing that you saw, meant that you had to. That was kind of what led you down that path. So if we fast forward a little bit now, is it a sort of a folk tale, or is it true that Global Witness was formed co-founded by yourself in a pub in London?
No, that's true. It's the best place to found anything, I find. I went backpacking. When I left my job, I went backpacking around the world, as many people do. Came back, thinking, I thought, well, I'll discover myself, and I didn't. I sort of learned a few things. I had no revelation particularly, and I thought, well, maybe I'll go around the world again. But I had 4 weeks between when I got back and when I thought I might go off again. And then I read this article in the Sunday Times magazine, and it was about a small environmental organisation called the Environmental Investigation Agency, based in Islington in North London. And the article was about them breaking an ivory smuggling ring by posing as ivory traders undercover, carrying secret cameras, and going into through their detective work, finding this depot in, I think it was Dubai. And they knew that in this warehouse was this ivory smuggling ring. But the other half of the warehouse was, I don't know, a transport company or something. And so they blagged their way into that half, got a very big cardboard box, put it on a forklift, carved a hole in the side, hoisted themselves up to the top of the partition wall and filmed through the hole on the other side. And they busted this Hong Kong Chinese smuggling ring, ivory smuggling ring. And I read that article, I thought, wow, that's cool.
Yeah, James Bond-esque.
Very James Bond-esque. And I thought, that's what I want to do. So the next day, that was a Sunday, the Monday, I toiled up to Islington, knocked on the door, got asked in, said I wanted to volunteer, and they said, fine. And they were like 7 people, I think, operating off a credit card, and about 7 volunteers on top. And I was given the job of essentially opening all of the letters that we're getting because of the article in the Sunday Times. So I was sitting on the floor because there were no available desks, and sort of looking through these letters, and a lot of them were quite from young people saying, I'd like to raise money I'd like to do a sponsored walk, I'd like to go and shake a can on the street, whatever. No one was answering the letters. There weren't enough people to answer the letters.
Wow,
so I started answering the letters, and I became a volunteer fundraiser, and then I'm taken on as a paid fundraiser. Anyway, long story short, I met 2 people at EIA, Charmian Gooch and Simon Taylor. Charmian Gooch was a campaigner looking at the ivory trade. Simon was a volunteer. And we just started talking. We got on. We went to the pub, and in the Betsy Trotwood pub off the Farringdon Road in London, we discovered that we were all individually interested in Cambodia, and Cambodia then in the early 90s was very big news because it's a country that had been through hell, through the Vietnam War. It was impacted by the Vietnam War, carpet bombed by the Americans, and then the Khmer Rouge, made famous or infamous, more infamous in the film The Killing Fields, this rebel group that had carried out the biggest genocide since World War II, killing millions of Cambodian people. And the United Nations mounted a peacekeeping intervention in Cambodia, biggest one they'd done to that time, 21,000 troops on the ground. So it was in the news, democratic elections, that kind of thing. We just saw these articles, and not many and not very complete, saying that it looks like the Khmer Rouge, who are occupying the western borders of Cambodia, western northern borders, are trading timber with Thailand. And we thought, well, if they're trading timber, presumably they're doing it for money. And if they're doing it for money, that money is probably for their war. And, as the lagers went down, thinking you need more lagers to do this well, thinking, well, if you cut that funding, then you stop the war, presumably. How would you cut the funding? Think, okay, well, knowing what we knew from EIA, doing undercover investigations, and what you would do is travel up and down the Thai-Cambodia border, find these timber companies and film them and ask them, are you getting timber from Cambodia? And ask them questions. And we thought, why doesn't someone do that? And we thought, well, why don't we? So that was the birth of Global Witness.
That's an amazing story. And a lot of people talk a lot in pubs. But what do you think was different for you? Why do you think you didn't wake up the next morning with a slightly sore head, think you had a great night and forget about it? What drove you to then actually see through your goal?
I think it just struck us, and I couldn't tell you really for what reason, as a really good idea. It shouldn't have done. We had no experience in doing this. I'd never used a secret camera, never even met one, never done any investigations. And apart from backpacking, I hadn't seen anything in Southeast Asia. And we were all in that kind of boat. But we just thought, actually, that's a good idea. And I think the thing that was sort of really made it different is that the first thing we asked ourselves when we heard about this trade was, is that an environmental issue or is that a human rights issue? And of course, it's both. Because it's environmental because the forest has been cut down, and human rights because the war's being fought on the proceeds. But at that time, no organisation, I think really no organisation, looked at that nexus. So you had human rights groups, you had environmental groups, but no one looked at that nexus. It's not that different today, actually. And I think we thought, well, we've found something special. We've found something that no one else is doing. Rather than, especially if you're trying to raise funds, you don't want to take someone else's funds to try and create something to do exactly the same thing they are. This was different. And we just thought, this is a really neat idea.
It's still true today, because when I read Very Bad People, it's so obvious that the connection between these trees being cut down, funding this war, this illegal war or genocide or whatever it might be, such an obvious connection. But as you say, I don't know why that connection hasn't been made by most people, myself included, until I discovered your wonderful book, that if we can stop this, we also stop that. Because, as you say, most organisations are islands, and they're environmental or they're financial or they're human rights or whatever they might be. But why isn't there an interlinking organisation? And that's what Global Witness presumably focuses on. Is that correct?
Yeah, it evolved from that. And I think actually what it demonstrated was a realization that you might, as an organisation, and this wasn't a conscious realization, but I think it was a fact, your organisation might have a particular, focus, a particular mission. But what if the world doesn't accord to that mission? And the world rarely does. The world is not so neat. And so, yes, we started off with that in mind. But as we evolved, and no doubt has come out during the conversation, you find something new that's connected to what you're doing. And in fact, if you don't tackle that, you're not going to succeed in what you're doing. And then you start tackling that too, and then another thing and another thing.
So when you were setting out down the global witness path, did you have goals and aspirations in mind? Was there a sort of, when I speak to people who are starting businesses, they will say, oh yes, I thought I wanted to be here or that. Did that happen for you?
No.
So it was day by day, literally day by day?
Well, no, we wanted to achieve what our plan was.
Of course.
Which was to shut down that timber trade and stop a war. We didn't have a timeline in place. Also, of course, when we began, we had absolutely no money. So when we began, it was completely up in the air. And I remember by the time that the anniversary of the first time we got any funding, because i.e. had been operating properly for a year, I was really surprised. I thought, my God, we've been going for a year. But no, we had no strategic plan. No.
It's very honest of you to say so, because a lot of people, I think, sometimes didn't have one either, but they might say in hindsight, it's easy to say, oh yes, we always knew we were going to be where we are today. But that wasn't the case for yourself.
I have an alternative view of entrepreneurism, which is that actually sometimes you should just go do it.
Yeah, and see what happens.
Yeah.
Very hard to plan out, because who knows who you're going to meet along the way and what twists and turns you're going to take.
Yeah, and we didn't know what we were doing, so it would have been silly to make a plan about what we didn't know what we were doing.
That's an interesting point, actually. Do you think part of the reason you went was the first time was through naivety? If you knew what you knew now back then, do you think you would have gone? Because it was so dangerous.
My wife had dinner with a famous English theatre director. She used to work in the theatre world, Peter Hall. And he said, never underestimate the power of naivety. And I'm a big believer in that. I think even if you do realise that maybe not the most sensible thing to do, no reason necessarily not to do it. But yes, in this case, completely naive. I mean, if you sort of look at it on the face of it, these three people with no experience and no money deciding to go off and do something like that was pretty silly.
To one of the most dangerous places on earth, but at the time, arguably, with genocides and murder and activists being killed as well, quite frequently, far more frequently than should obviously ever happen. And yet, you appear to have survived unscathed. Do you think that was just pure luck?
No, not pure luck. Certainly quite a lot of luck. We were not gung-ho. We didn't want to get killed. And so we did take precautions about that. In hindsight, insufficient. There were a couple of times where we got away with it through luck rather than anything else. But the basic things. We had to do the investigation on the Thai side of the border. We knew that it would be fatal on the Cambodian side because it's Khmer Rouge territory, and they very specifically, rather like IS years later, wanted to kill Westerners. They offered a reward of $5,000 for Westerners. Wow. So there was we weren't going to go there. And we just did things like, it was very early days of mobile phones. We used to carry one and have a kind of, on that first investigation, it was Simon and myself, Charmin is back in the UK, and we had a phone protocol. We'd phone in once a day. We'd constructed these very elaborate, actually very good, I can't remember how I found out about them, but codes. So we had a code name for everything. Places, commodities, whatever. And so we would be very circumspect about what we were doing. You have to remember this is pre-internet age. So that benefited us as well as hindered us. It benefited us in that, we had a false business card. I probably got it in my wallet. I could show it to you, but had false name, false phone number, real phone number, false name, but no one could check it because I couldn't Google it. Unfortunately, we didn't have Google Maps or anything like that, so but we didn't know about that, so we just survived without those things.
And talking about technology, obviously you were doing a lot of undercover surveillance. And I presumably I haven't seen one personally, but these cameras are substantially larger than they are today. What is that like? What was going through your mind when you're constructing this huge camera, trying to conceal it, knowing that you're going to try and entrap a very dangerous people?
Didn't think much when we were constructing the camera, and you're right, it was a very cumbersome thing. Like now you can get a camera and a shirt button, you could buy a pinhole lens, which, so the lens itself was tiny, but it was mounted on a circuit board about the size of a cigarette packet. But you had to record from that. That had no power to do anything. So you basically had to connect that to a battery pack and also to a camcorder. So you've got this camera and a camcorder. But the camcorder, because it was only taking in what was coming from the camera, couldn't record sound, so you needed an amplifier. The camera was really juice heavy, so that needed 8 AA batteries, which lasted about an hour. And you pack all that, and what our decision was to actually pack it in a camera bag, because, no one thinks you're filming them if they see a camera bag. They think you're filming them if you've got a camera. And so they think, the camera's in, if they think anything, they think the camera's in the camera bag. So that was quite well thought through. But what we discovered when we first started filming bad guys was, I remember one particular one where I've got the camera behind me on a shelf in someone's hotel room. And we knew by this time that battery pack got red hot. And I was terrified it might catch fire, So, but through the interview, which I've still got it somewhere, half the time I'm talking, if you're the bad guy, I'm talking to you, then I'm okay. Yeah. But the other thing is that if the target sort of looks over your shoulder, you think, they're seeing the camera, you're really panicking.
Yeah.
And they weren't. And what we had to get to was learning the psychology of doing this. It was the most important thing, as we discovered, is that, number one, you think they have no reason to suspect you're secretly filming them, especially then, because more people get secretly filmed now than did then. So they have no reason particularly to suspect you have a camera. So you just have to have that in your head and brazen it out, basically. But I never did ever lose that nervousness of discovery.
Didn't you?
No.
And so did it ever come close to, really getting into trouble, being caught or the camera being seen or having any issues?
Yeah, a few times over the years. I guess the one that comes first to mind is, and this is also actually carrying on that theme of psychology, is a particular logging company. So when we arrived in Thailand, and we went down to the southeast corner of Thailand, we didn't actually know where these companies were. All that had been reported was there was a trade, but there's a 700-kilometre long border. And on the Cambodian side, most of that border is rainforest. On the Thai side, most of it's cleared, so it's farmland. And the Thai roads are okay. So we drive along the Thai roads and just find roads that were heading towards the border. But when we first arrived, we sort of looked at the map and thought, these like old American Vietnam War era maps, saying, okay, well, if you look at southeast Thailand, it's a really thin sliver of land sandwiched between Cambodia and the sea that's Thai territory. Let's start there because it's thin and be easier to see things, won't it? And actually it was. It was a stupid idea, but it worked. And we found this company and there was no one there, but a lot of logs, and filmed that. And then the next day we found this track and we followed it and we went off the main road, such as it was, down a dirt track for 4 kilometres. And it was very remote. If anything happened there, you'd be in bother. And we passed a Thai marine base, and from anything we knew, the Thai military were to be avoided. Just whizzed on by, and then came to this logging company, and there were hundreds and hundreds of rainforest trees sort of laid out in rows in this big cordoned off area, probably the size of a couple of football pitches or something. And on the far side of it were the logging company offices, a series of wooden huts. And we stopped at the gate and sort of thought, should we go in? Should we not? A bit scary. Got out, got back in, and by the time we actually did go in, everyone was suspicious as hell because they'd all stopped and looked, who are these white guys at the gate? This is because in that area of Thailand, I don't know about now, but there were no tourists then.
No.
And so everyone was highly suspicious. So you start off on the wrong foot. And we finally got out our business card and talked, and they were not wildly communicative. But as we left, we turned around and took a photo, and they didn't like that at all.
I bet.
And so they got in a car and started chasing after us. And we thought, stop that, and drove away and had a bit of a car chase down that track.
Oh, so they chased you?
Oh, they did, yeah. But on the main road, we
Wow.
lost them. But that you learn from that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you talk about psychology there quite a bit. What is the advice that you would give for anybody in a situation where they need that psychological advantage? Is it, what is it? What is it? If you turned up and acted like you owned the place, is it false confidence? Is it confidence that you need to project regardless of how you're feeling internally? What is it that helps?
Confidence is a good word, because actually what you have to be is a confidence trickster.
Yeah.
That's essentially what you have to do. And that's what we learned, is that, number one, they have no reason to disbelieve you. Have a story worked out. Be very confident in your presentation of that. And bullshit wildly. And so, what we learned at that time is next time, drive in straight up to the offices, walk up to the boss's door, out with the business card. Hi, I'm Patrik or Chris Manners, I was, from Universal Export. Want to chat about buying timber? Oh, yeah, and you don't give them time to think. That's part of it. It's not, they have no time to consider. They have no time to phone anyone, no time to whatever. They're
Overwhelmed,
right.
just, that confidence. You turn up like you're in the place and then you don't have time to think, as you say.
That's right. And there would always be two of us.
What was the name of your company? What was the name of your company?
It was Universal Export.
Why was that? I think I know.
I think you do. When we were probably in another pub, thinking, okay, we needed to have a fake ID, and we thought, well, Ian Fleming had created this cover company, Universal Export, for James Bond. And we thought, well, if it's good enough for James Bond, it's good enough for us. So that's what we did. We had our Universal Export cards.
I guess you just had to hope you didn't come across any big James Bond fans.
Well, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
But not many people knew that.
No. I saw on a TED Talk recently that you did, that you were saying some of the things that need to happen for significant change. And one of them, which surprised me, was the WWF, the World Wildlife Foundation. They need to do their job. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, that talk's going back a few years now. I found over the years, and this is not a blanket, criticism, because those organisations, them and others like them, have done a lot of really good work. But for their size, their wealth and the number of staff they have, I think they could do a lot more. But they were also, I think, guilty of what's become known as fortress conservation, which is, okay, we want to protect this area of land, and so they'll do a deal with the government or whatever to be able to manage this land. And then the numerous cases of the people who actually lived there, whose land it was, local communities, traditional communities, actually suffering as a result of that. There was this idea that, to conserve land, you shouldn't have people on it, so kick them off it, for example, or keep them in one bit of it. And it's just such an outdated concept.
But presumably these people have been living there for generations and generations.
Absolutely.
Perfectly fine.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is highly problematic. I think it's slightly better than it was. The other thing, and we've written reports on this, so it's no secret about WWF, again, going back a few years, so I'm not talking about now necessarily, where they would work out kind of conservation deals with businesses. A palm oil company would agree to behave according to a certain standard. And we and other organisations have kept on coming out with exposés showing how this simply didn't work. These companies are running rings around them. So that was a bad policy. But one thing I found really bad, what they did at those times, was when you said, when you asked how much money do you actually take from companies, they wouldn't tell you. And I think for a voluntary organisation, that's just not acceptable.
Transparency is really, really important.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I guess, is that an issue that Global Witness in particular has? Because of the nature of the work you do, you have to be very careful who you take donations from?
Yes, we do. We have an ethical fundraising policy, And basically, because our work sort of spread out far beyond what we've been talking about so far, into looking at the world of corruption, malfeasance by big businesses, governments, whatever. You cannot afford to be taking money from someone who, or a business rather, who's doing something counter to what you are. I'll give you an example. We were given some leaked documents once, and they were a treasure trove showing a paper trail of corruption in a West African country, the Republic of Congo, whereby the son of the president was the boss of the state oil company and siphoning, perfect family authority, just siphon off the country's money into his offshore bank accounts. And that information is great, and we took it, but the company that gave it to us was a vulture fund. A vulture fund being a company that buys up a country's debt and then basically tries to capitalize on it, and make a profit. That's what they do. We had no problem taking the paperwork, but they did offer us a donation. I think in good faith, but we said no way. For a couple of reasons. One, I can't stand up and say I love vulture funds, and secondly, it'd be totally, we won't take money in that way. Someone say, well, here's some information, here's some money with it. That that's just
what's
not
in
great
it for them.
And also with the corporate world, if we were working on oil companies or mining companies or banks, you can't take money from those sectors. And when you think of how wide our work spread, you simply run out of sectors. We don't have a blanket rule against company money, but the reality is we've only ever taken corporate money from, I think, the Co-op Bank and the Body Shop.
Really? Because and is that not because you haven't been offered it, clearly, but because of the moral on what you do?
It's what we do. If the money's coming, if the money is from somebody's profits who's made that, they're not necessarily evil, but it's counter to what we're doing. Then it would be crazy to do it. And if they're in any way connected to what we're doing, so if we're working on an anti-corruption law about the mining industry, then of course you can't take money from a mining company.
But it's not always as straightforward as that either, is it? Because individuals, incredibly wealthy individuals, and corporations are now becoming so big that they might be twice removed, but there is a connection between them and by some way as the network, as you said earlier, they might be connected and you don't even realize at first. So it must be really daunting to try and work out sort of who you can and can't take funds from and who you can and can't trust. And
we have a very rigorous process. I mean, it's a lot of research and a lot of box ticking. We're not perfect either. I think, the bottom line is there is actually no clean money. And so, one of our biggest funders is George Soros, for example, who comes in from a lot of criticism from a lot of people. But I think as an investor, he was certainly, or he is rather, certainly not an ethical investor per se. But what he did choose to do was put, to date, about $36 billion into the human rights movement, pro-democracy movements, etc., around the world. So on one hand, I think, okay, the money, it's not great, but he's an extremely active, committed campaigner. And he also worked with us when we started working on extractive industries. We couldn't get meetings with the boss of an oil company or Tony Blair or George Bush, whatever. He could. And that he was an active campaigner. So that's kind of, it's an area where we receive criticism, but I feel I can justify it. But no, there are other areas where you think, okay, we take money from the Ford Foundation, Ford Motor Cars, but so we wouldn't, take money from the motor industry who's producing a car now, but the foundation was split from the company God knows when, in the 30s or 40s or whatever it was. Same with the Rockefellers. So there is a dividing line.
It's very hard, isn't it? Because I think, where do you draw the line? The work you're trying. I think people should understand that the work that you're trying to do is good, and sometimes I guess it's impossible, as you said. where the money's come from, where the money's going, and how it's circulated, who these companies are in business with, second or twice, or even sometimes third times removed. It's very difficult, isn't it, to be absolutely pristine, but also get anything done, because you just end up never leaving the office.
I have what I call my Radio 4 test, which is if I was on the Radio 4 Today programme and they said, you took money from so-and-so, what do you say? If I felt that I could honestly defend that decision in a way that the listeners would go, yeah, that sounds fine, then I'd be happy. Very often you hear people ask some awkward question and you just think, oh, come on. So I had that test. It is difficult, but it's also essential. And also I should say that one of the things I've always found quite fun, actually, especially in the earlier days when we were less known than we are, is that when we produced a report which exposed some wrongdoing, some corrupt guy's business, they would always, without exception virtually, say, oh, well, you must be funded by this or that. So
a competitor or something.
Yeah, so when we exposed the issue of blood diamonds, we were accused of being funded by the French Secret Service, which was a bit bizarre one. I don't know where that one came from.
Do you know why?
No.
Right, okay.
No idea.
Right, okay.
And that was in Angola in the 90s. But then we exposed corrupt oil business in Angola, and the Angolan government accused us of being funded by the diamond industry.
How funny.
And very often we're accused by people, oh, well, you're part of a Soros plot. So we will always be targeted. We didn't know that when we started.
Of course.
We had our ethical fundraising thing before that, but when we started really hurting people, they couldn't get why we did it. They just simply didn't understand, well, why are they doing this? They must be doing it for somebody.
Yeah.
They didn't understand why we were doing it.
That speaks a lot to their sort of mindset and their context, doesn't it? There must be some sort of ulterior motive or some financial gain perhaps for yourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If there can't be any altruism there.
It can't possibly be just for moral reasons.
No.
Yeah, just because it's the right thing to do. What do you think, and I've been excited to ask you this question because they get a very mixed reaction. What are your views on Just Stop Oil and their sort of disruptive activism?
It's an interesting question. I've had long discussions about it with my wife and friends. I actually agree with what they do. And the argument I use, and I thought about it, and there are two arguments I use relating to them. One of which is that the climate movement has been going for like 30 years or more. Nothing that, and I include ourselves within this, we have done has worked. Nothing. We tried to talk to the politicians, we tried to talk to the companies, you had the Rio Earth Summit, lots of pledges were made, none of them kept. I think, what else can we do? The world is frying, we're all going to toast, and we don't have the luxury of time anymore. We didn't then, but we certainly don't now. That's one argument I use. It's not like it was the first thing. This is what has resulted from the failure of the people who should be making these decisions, the bosses of companies and our political leaders, to do anything. The other side is, if you look at the history of the suffragettes, they were doing exactly the same thing. Exactly. They were defacing artwork in museums. They were actually burning down houses in places, not with people in them, I hasten to add. And recently, was it British Heritage, one of those organisations, unveiled the blue plaques on the houses where these people lived, who had been convicted of all of these things years ago. So you could argue that you wouldn't have women's suffrage if those very same activities hadn't been carried out. And you just got to Google it, it's right there. So Just Stop Oil doing exactly the same thing. And I guess the women's movement back in those days, that we tried everything else.
Yeah. And do you think that in the future there'll be blue packs for Just Stop Oil protesters today?
I think there will.
Really? You think that's how they'll be viewed in history?
I think there will, because back then with the suffragettes, in the very sort of patriarchal society, men could not believe that women could, vote, let alone have an equal place at work, blah, 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 blah. And now we've all accepted that. You'd be a very unreasonable person and pilloried if you didn't think that. And I think we're in the same place on climate. I think in a century's time, people will look back, if we're still here as a race in a century's time, and go, thank God they did that. And how how crazy people were to object to it. They had all the information there. We know the world's flying. We didn't do anything.
Yeah.
These guys did, but no one else did.
It's all about context, isn't it, I suppose? It's the context of the time and looking back in hindsight.
Yeah.
Okay, so you believe in what they're doing. Do you believe it'll be effective? Because a lot of and I know they haven't been going for so long, but a lot of the feedback with the public is obviously they're alienating the public. There's a big feeling that, if they're going to have any effect where it matters, the King's horse was the suffragettes, but they weren't stopping normal people getting to work, as far as I know. Do you think it'll work? I understand you agree with what they do, but do you think it'll be...
I don't honestly know if it'll work. I know that nothing else has. The suffragettes did cause people tremendous inconvenience, and they did stop traffic.
Did they?
Oh God, yeah. They threw themselves under carriages in the street. They were doing all sorts of things. They were going to prison for it. And if I was sort of looking at what Just Up will do, I don't quite know how it will work. It's not the most obvious, route alienating people. I agree. If I was, delayed on my way to the airport by a demonstration, I'd be pissed off. But I think the ends do justify the means, and I think that the press that they get, all publicity is good publicity. More and more people are becoming aware of it. More and more people are becoming aware of how concerned some people are. And I think that their peers and people younger than they are, because they're all ages, could well look to them and go, yeah, this is great. This is a way I can actually help change something, because writing a letter to my MP hasn't worked.
Yeah, it's something better than nothing, I guess. And you say that we're all going to fry. So do you believe if we do nothing as a planet that we could face extinction genuinely?
Genuinely, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah.
And in what sort of time frame would you imagine?
I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but I have seen people talk about it. I mean, within 150 years, something like that.
Wow.
You only have to look at the way things are going in terms of the fires, ripping through Canada, through Southern Europe, the extra heat, increased heat over the place. I was hearing some figures this morning about, Northern Europe right now is about 6 degrees hotter at the time of the year than it should be. Our ability to grow as much food in the Northern Hemisphere will decline with the extra heat at the same time as people, in their hundreds of thousands are fleeing from the south, by boat or whatever, to the north because their places are coming unlivable in. They arrive here and, apart from all of the political and racial connotations of that, racist connotations of that, how long can we actually feed people?
Sustain,
I think we're absolutely in the middle of a massive crisis, and I'm certainly not the first person to say it, but
absolutely.
It's very serious.
Do you think we'll turn it around?
We could.
We can,
but we have to do it quite
news.
Radically.
Right.
Interestingly, the panel I was just on, we're talking about these things. I think we have, collectively the money, the brains, the tools to do this. I think it's the political, not just the political will, but that's essential. We've been badly failed by our leaders. At the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, the pledges are made at all, how brilliant things would be, how much we'll have reduced emissions by, blah, blah. Not one of those pledges have been kept, by any of the 120 world leaders who were there.
Not one.
Not one. And we only have to do that. We only have to say, okay, it's like the big row in London at the moment about the emission zone. It's like, it'll inconvenience motorists. Well, sorry.
It's okay. No, it's your interview. Say what you like.
It's like, the world's frying. It might take you longer to get to work. Come on, let's get sense of proportion here. I think we know that if we can stop the deforestation of the rainforest, or rather, if we don't stop the deforestation of the rainforest, we sure as hell lost the battle. We can stop it. And that's not just the palm oil companies or the beef companies or the logging companies that are doing it. It's the banks that are bankrolling those companies, that whole chain of responsibility, and then eventually us as the buyers. And luckily, we and many other organisations have got a law coming in, or the law has been accepted in the European Union, the Corporate Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive, which will stop goods being imported that contain environmental or social harms in their supply chain. That kind of thing is really powerful. And the bottom line is that we have to break the power of the fossil fuel industry. That's the number one thing. We can't turn off the lights just like that. We know that. We need to fade it out. It's going the other way. The International Energy Agency has said that if we explore any new, or start exploiting any new fossil fuel reserves, we cannot stay with a 1.5 degree temperature rise. Our government in the UK has just authorised new licences in the North Sea. The Greek government's done it in the Mediterranean. The Americans are doing it in Alaska. It's madness.
Yeah.
It's like, you've heard the message, you've heard the science. What are you doing?
And it is science.
It is science.
Yeah. You say there that the law that's being passed is an important and powerful piece. But why is that so if the people you generally deal with are law-breaking, sort of, global corruption isn't... They're breaking laws already, so why would another one make any difference?
Because this is at the consumer end.
Right.
So if a company cannot demonstrate that its supply chain is clean, it can't import into the EU.
Right.
It can do what it's like on the ground. It can be as nasty and as illegal as it likes in Brazil or wherever, but not if it wants to sell to the EU.
Right. Okay. That's clever. Okay. So I don't think anyone in the world would disagree that the war on drugs has been a catastrophic failure, and the war on corruption, I would argue, is even harder because the people, the customers, the consumers of these illicit goods probably don't even know that they're consuming them, be it when they fuel up at the tank, bank with a particular bank, or buy wood or whatever. They might not necessarily know that they're dealing with an illegal substance. And so why it would be completely reasonable for someone to suggest that the war on corruption is unwinnable. But why do you keep fighting?
I think it's unwinnable in the sense that one will never stop corruption in its entirety, but you can make it a lot harder and a lot more expensive to do, which makes the corrupt's work much more difficult to do. And that's already happening, I think. We've our movement, if you like, have got various laws relating to anti-corruption, bribery, making sure the extractive industries declare the money they pay to the governments of the countries they work in. All of those things which are helpful and do make a difference. But I think the game changer, and again, there will always be corruption, of course, will be when company executives start going to jail. And that doesn't happen. So, for example, and you see these things in the news, like HSBC, for example, was fined some years back, I can't remember, just under $2.9 billion for laundering Mexican drug money.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's cost of doing business. And that's not much money for HSBC.
It sounds a lot of money until you realise that they made $14 billion doing the illicit activity in the first place.
Basically, yes.
So they basically paid VAT.
Basically, yes. And you see, numerous cases of banks in Switzerland and elsewhere, involved in money laundering, and that's what happens. If you get a chief executive of a bank in Wormwood Scrubs, you'll see industry change very, very fast.
And that's really powerful, actually. That you make a great point there. So, because money is, the banks sit at the top of nearly everything.
Yeah.
That's how it all starts, because they finance and they fund and they allow money to move as well. Even if you don't need funding and you're doing something illicitly, you still need to enter that funds into the system to buy the house and the trappings of your crime. How does Global Witness, how do we make that happen?
We and others have worked on that. And I can't, to be honest, remember exactly where we've got to on it. But we've certainly been calling for that. And I think it's a door that will eventually open. But I think, the public should demand that, because if you get a company that makes a really bad decision, like, that's affecting so many people, like laundering Mexican drug money. I mean, how bad can you be? Someone took that decision. The bank didn't take that decision. The bank's a piece of paper and a record on a computer.
Bricks and steel, yeah.
Yeah, it's someone took the decision, and there has to be a certain level. It's also not just about the low-level person who might have pressed the button. It's the person up there.
Yeah. Because I think in that particular case, actually, he was pressurised and his family, were threatened. But somebody 3,000 miles away in an office somewhere learned of this and turned a blind eye because of the profit.
Absolutely, and because they can. Too big to fail.
Yeah, too big to fail, indeed. Has technology played a part in Global Witness's work? And if so, does technology help? Are you using technology?
Yeah.
How so?
I think technology has been incredible. I mean, as I said at the beginning, we started pre-internet. So in all the obvious ways, like being able to put our stuff on a website, etc., etc. But for example, we did an investigation. This is just an example because we're doing this stuff all the time now, of trying to find out. So there's the world's biggest beef company is called JBS, Brazilian company. And they were, due to past misdemeanors, obliged by the Brazilian government to only source beef from certified deforestation-free farms. And if they disobeyed that, they'd broken federal law. So what we did, suspecting that they had found a way around it, was to get satellite imagery showing farm boundaries from the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture, then satellite imagery showing deforestation, both time-stamped. And then we hired a few servers in Sao Paulo and managed to download 3 million cattle movement orders. So every cow from birth to slaughter is documented, where it's been, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Put all that together and we could show that JBS was buying from loads of farms where deforestation was happening when that happened. And I can't remember the figures now, like 140,000 hectares worth or something of forest destroyed. So that we could not...
140,000 hectares?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, that's happening a lot in the Amazon, but this was just the example we showed. And without, our data investigations team, you can't go through 3 million cattle movement orders or do the satellite stuff. And we're doing the same now with, transshipments of Russian oil. Sort of leaving Russia, where it's transshipped, where it goes, all that kind of thing. I
saw you retweeted actually about Russian oil, saying that 1 in 20 flights that leaves the UK are still being is still Russian fueled. What's the implication of that?
Well, there are various implications of that. So essentially what we did, it was just what I was talking about, is you're getting Russian tankers going into the Mediterranean in international waters off Greece, transshipping the oil into other tankers, very often Western-owned. And a lot of those are going to these 3 particular Indian refineries. And so we looked at the feedstocks of those refineries and found that on average, 45% of the oil they're refining is Russian. And then we just picked it again as an example. It's a much bigger picture than this. We looked at UK imports of jet fuel, i.e. kind of diesel, from those refineries. And it was 6.2 million barrels, I think it was in the first 6 months of this year. Ergo, 45%, 2.3 million, not
Russian.
molecule, you can't trace the molecules.
No, of course.
On average, it was going to be Russian, which means 1 in 20 flights if you boil it down. And it also means that it generated around a minimum of $53 million for the Kremlin in tax, 122 million, I think, in revenue for Russia. Those are figures from the Russian Ministry of Finance, which is enough to buy 2,500 Iranian-made drones. That's insidious. And we put this to the British government, and they said, Oh no. We banned Russian oil, and there's none coming in.
Really? Right.
But there's a loophole, which is if it's refined outside Russia, it's not Russian. Right. So, go read George Orwell, double speak. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
It's Russian.
Is that deliberate, do you think? Is that an oversight, a genuine loophole, corruption? What do you think's led to that rule that says anything? Because clearly we all know as reasonable people that, of course, it's still Russian. So why does that exist?
The loophole?
Yes.
I think probably because it hasn't caught up with the times.
Right.
I don't know that answer categorically. The fact that the British government can deny that something that's coming in that's 45% Russian means we're not buying from Russia is hard to.
Well, why have they got the money then? Yeah, let's stop paying them. If it's not theirs, why have they got the money?
Yeah, and it's crazy because we're putting, we in the EU are putting how much money into tanks, etc., which we're giving to Ukraine, quite rightly, in my opinion.
But then we're also funding Russia effectively through purchase.
Funding Russia on the other side. We're buying them the drones to blow up the tanks we supplied them. It's. I don't know if you ever read Catch-22.
No.
Okay, so it's about an American airbase in World War II in Italy, I think. And there's a guy in there called Milo Minderbinder, and he's the ultimate capitalist. And what he does is he sells bombs to the American Air Force, and he sells anti-aircraft ammunition to the Germans.
Right. Yeah.
What was happening?
Yeah. But we're on the wrong side of the trade because we're donating the money and purchasing the oil.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. So we're not even. We can't even have that. Yeah. What would you say is the single biggest threat to the environment today? I know there is a lot, but what's the single sort of biggest issue? Would you say?
Probably might not be the answer you want. I mean, I think the biggest single issue is that our political leadership, and I'm talking about globally, do not take it seriously. They don't take
really at all. Really, you really mean that?
If they took it seriously, they'd sort everything else out. They don't take the environment seriously. So, I could answer in a more commodity-based way. Cut the fossil fuel industry for sure.
Yeah.
If it's a straightforward question like that, fossil fuel industry, biggest problem. But the biggest problem is, in fact, our political leadership, because it's not just about climate change. It's like the sewage being pumped into our rivers. How's that okay?
It's across the board. Yeah. And it's the pinnacle is the political elite.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not talking about any particular party. They're all as useless as each other on this one, as far as I can tell. Apart from the Greens.
Can the UK really make a difference? Because it's all very well and good, sitting in the road and trying to make a difference, like the suffragettes. But the world's a much bigger place now, and women's suffrage hasn't been solved in many other countries. But this is different because it's a global environment. We need a global solution. So whereas the suffragettes may have done what they, in large part what they set out to do, that hasn't made the lives of women in certain countries better. So how do we get China, for example, to agree with this? Because I've been to China and seen firsthand that I don't think they're doing much.
I think I've never been to China, so you're ahead of me on that one. They are, in terms of renewables, doing a phenomenal amount. I couldn't give you the figures, but they are responsible for the vast majority of solar farms globally, i.e. compared to every other country in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, so they're doing that in a massive scale. Now, at what cost to the people on the ground who are there, that I have no idea. That might be another story. So I think China is actually very serious on the environment as it affects them. And, they're very sensitive when you see these terrible pictures of Beijing shrouded in smog. They're very worried about that because that's affecting their people directly, and their people there's no amount of censorship that can hide that. So I think they're doing a lot. I don't know, I can't really make the comparison whether they're doing more than the West or not. I think, it will bring us on to another subject, transition minerals in a minute, but I think that, again, what I said before, all of our countries in the West, in Europe, States, UK, we're all still busily out there ferreting for new oil and gas reserves.
That's in other countries, not their own.
Well, both. The UK is doing it in the North Sea as well. It's a madness.
If a democratically elected official who is acting on behalf of their people, by definition, decides that they're going to cut down all their trees, and they are their trees, unless you disagree, who are we or anyone else or any other country to tell them that they shouldn't or can't? If you believe in a country's sovereignty, should we be telling, clearly for the environmental benefits we should, but should we really be telling other people how to behave?
We can't be telling them how to behave, but I always think the sovereignty question is an interesting one, because how many countries are truly sovereign? How many countries exist purely on their own resources? So they're probably very willing to have foreign investment. They're probably very willing to have foreign aid in certain cases. They're probably very willing to join, regional trade blocs and that kind of thing. Sovereignty is something that countries usually bring up to defend the indefensible, as far as I can tell. But no, we can't. If a country says we're going to cut down all our trees, they can cut down all their trees. We can react to that diplomatically by not buying the wood or not buying other products from there or whatever. We can do those things. But no one can tell people what to do. What I guess we always hope to do is for people to see, the right way to go. But going back to your point about it's their trees, in Brazil, who's there? The people who have been there since before the white settlers came in.
The indigenous people,
who've always lived in the forests.
Yes.
Or is it a bunch of, the descendants of colonists in Brasilia and Sao Paulo?
Yeah, fair point. It's interesting. I understand. I think most people would understand where blood diamonds go, generally in jewellery, etc. Maybe sometimes in industry, and where fossil fuels generally end up in vehicles and other modes of transport and consumption, fire, etc. But where does wood go generally? Is it ending up in huge sort of? Is it? I'm just picking a name at random. Is it IKEA furniture, or is it far more bespoke than that because it's so old and precious, etc.?
Do you mean like tropical hardwood?
Yes. Where are these rainforests? Where are these 140,000 hectares of logs going?
Okay, so well, in that case, and that's a slightly different one because I'm sure those logs are going somewhere, but the deforestation was carried out for the beef industry as opposed to the logging industry. But they will have used that timber. But yeah, so going to the issue of tropical hardwood. A lot of it is used in construction, for sure, around the world. Luxury hardwood for furniture, those kind of things, wherever you see wood.
And is there a large player at the other end of that? Because, of course, there's large logging companies, there's big banks, there's countries involved. But it's a lot. What I'm trying to get to is it's a lot to just sort of dissipate into small boutique, expensive furniture shops. There must be an end buyer.
Well, a lot. I mean, China is the biggest single buyer of tropical hardwood, I believe. But collectively, the West buys an awful lot of it. And of course, flooring is something I forgot to say as well. Going into flooring, but the Japanese have used tropical hardwood for concrete shuttering in construction. Use it, lay your concrete, chuck it away.
Right.
I don't know if they're still doing that, but they were doing.
That's really.
It's really bonkers.
Yeah.
In some countries in Asia, they really value rosewood furniture. Rosewood's very rare, so very high-priced trees and in danger of extinction. Because of that, the construction industry, people like building bridges with hardwood sides, whatever. Decks for ships, decks for yachts. It soaks up a lot of wood. Garden furniture.
Garden furniture.
Well, that's true.
Is it? Yeah. So, you, in Very Bad People, you accuse conglomerates, very powerful people, countries even, of some very heinous crimes, including murder and assassination. Were you concerned about your personal safety when the book was ready to release? And have you had any issues like that? Any pushback or threats or anything like that?
No, I think when we've been carrying out investigations, we're certainly very careful. We've learned a lot since our early days. We have strong security protocols. I'm not particularly worried about our personal security. I shouldn't be saying this probably, because we're not dealing with the drugs trade. We're not dealing with the Russian mafia, who both of whom would bump you off without a thought. The biggest risks to us are legal. That's not to say that there are no risks. There could be, but legal's the one that's probably the most worrying.
And do you get a lot of legal challenges from these companies?
Yeah.
And how are they generally dealt with? Because they could be expensive, I would imagine. That must be a real drain on your resources and time and brain power.
Yeah, it's a very big issue for us. And as an organisation that names and shames. So we have a very rigorous legal processes. We have an in-house media lawyer. We bring in specialist external media lawyers. We have insurance. And we have a very rigorous fact-checking process that our campaigners and anyone who works with us want to shoot us for. That's an unfortunate analogy, but anyway. So it's very strong, and it doesn't mean you won't get sued, because there are frivolous suits, the slap suits you may have heard about. But we try and make ourselves as bulletproof as we can be. But as I say, that doesn't stop you being sued, because some of the people we're targeting are so rich that their actual strategy with these slap suits, which stands for strategic litigation against public participation, i.e. tie you up in vastly expensive legal battles so you can't function.
Yeah.
It's essentially what that means. And we've been threatened with a few of those.
And also it means that in the media it might be portrayed that you're innocent until proven guilty and this company is suing you for something, so therefore you must have done something wrong or said something wrong, even though it could be completely unfounded. You're absolutely banged to rights. You're completely in the right. There's categorically, proof beyond all reasonable doubt, and they still sue.
Yes, but in this case, the media would be on our side because they get hit with them too.
Right, of course. Yeah,
So they are probably in the forefront of that battle ahead of us, I should think.
Are they your friend, generally speaking, the media?
Broadly, yes. I mean, that doesn't mean everyone's always going to say nice things about us. But, the media for us is an essential tool because obviously we want to get our findings out there as widely as possible. And because a politician will look much more closely, if we're advocating with a politician for a change in the law, they will be far more interested in something that they know the media is breathing down their neck on than something that the media isn't interested in. So there's a strategic element to that as well.
So it's about applying pressure, because at the end of the day, their first and sometimes only interest is votes. So it's what the people want, effectively.
Exactly, and so that means the campaign wins you can get, which don't compromise a politician's, track record or something, are easier to get. If it's something that they really have to put themselves out on. So it's much easier to get a politician on the side of, say, blood diamonds, because, and this is something I've always held close actually, is that there are some campaigns which are no-brainers, i.e. no one would dare to go and say, actually it's fine to trade blood diamonds, it'd be
political or social suicide.
So those are the battles you'll win. But if you're saying, okay, we need these oil companies to reduce their emissions, blah, 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 and the politicians are all taking money from the oil companies, they're not going to do that. Or the government is.
BP to pay more than, 22 pence per person in the UK after making 30 billion pounds profit?
Yeah.
That's just staggering, isn't it?
It's extraordinary.
That's true, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
30 billion pounds profit, and they pay 20 pence per person.
Yeah, 22.
22 pence per person tax, for the UK in tax.
That's right. And I think this is one of the Ukraine war, and I hope this is actually a nail in the coffin of the fossil fuel industry, because, as you know, because of the Ukraine war, the price of fossil fuels went up. And it became not just, the fossil fuel industry, not just a climate related thing. They're actually costing, very ordinary people, who are hit by this cost of living crisis, making people's lives very hard, making it hard for some people to put enough food on the table. And I think that will create an anger against that industry. Because if you look at the figures, and I'm just trying to drag them out. So in 2022, the fossil fuel industry made 195, the five biggest companies made $195 billion profit, which is 120% more than they made the year before. It's the most they've ever made in 1 year. And of that, I think it's $134 billion is regarded as excess profit because it's related to these price rises. And if you think that, the flood damage in Pakistan, devastating, has got, hooked up a bill of 14.9 billion. The oil companies could pay that just like that.
Yeah. I mean, the NHS, for example, the NHS in the UK, the pay rises, and they could just do it no issue.
Absolutely. But they're getting away with it. They're just getting very big dividends.
Forgive me, but I think you contradicted yourself there because you said, due to the war in Ukraine, the costs have risen. But if that's all additional profit, that wouldn't exist if there was additional cost or if it was proportional.
The cost
so
to
are they
the
just
consumer.
using that as an excuse to put the price up?
Sorry, the cost to the consumer.
Right.
Not their cost.
So, but where's that additional cost come from then?
Well, market. Trading.
So they can just charge more?
Yeah. Because, you buy and sell oil.
No, I understand. But I just want to make clear that if they've had a bumper year because of this event, it doesn't make sense that you'd have a bumper year if that event was costing you more money, but it clearly can't be costing them more money because they've had a bumper year.
I should have made that clear. It's absolutely the criminal aspect of it. I don't mean literally criminal in that case. It's the way the system is, that their production costs haven't gone up at all. Just their profit did. Because the oil traders went, oh, there's a war, price ratchets up.
Put the right price up. Because we can, and people just go, well, it's the war.
Yeah.
But it's not the war if there's no extra cost.
It's the war is what, it's like, the share price going up and down because of the traders' nervousness about some event. And that's what this is. That's all that is. It hasn't made oil any more scarce or expensive to produce. It's purely the trading that goes on in Switzerland or wherever it goes on.
I think if people realised that, they'd be absolutely furious.
I'm bloody furious.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, yeah. How does Global Witness? We're coming to the end now because I know you're incredibly busy and you've got things to be doing, and I so appreciate all the time you've given us. How does Global Witness and other organisations get people in the street who have the power, gladly still, to make a difference? I.e., if they all just stopped buying a particular type of product, there would be no demand. Rosewood would therefore not be in demand and wouldn't be cut down, presumably. But how do you get people to engage who have, cost of living crisis, real problems, children to feed, bills to pay? How do you get them to engage in a fight against problems they can't see or feel yet?
Yeah, I mean, we're not the most expert organisation on that. So, but the approach we took, which I mentioned earlier, is to, play a role in getting this supply chain law in the EU, for example, with like an equivalent in the UK, so that the consumer doesn't have to make these choices. The responsibility about buying something that's not tainted with blood or whatever shouldn't actually be the consumer's responsibility.
No, I agree.
It should be the importer's responsibility. Sadly, it often is the consumer's responsibility. But yeah, we've never been a grassroots organisation, so we're not, unlike, say, Greenpeace or Amnesty, which have, hundreds of thousands of members and can mobilise, vast amounts of the public.
To boycott or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll take part in those things occasionally, but we don't have that footfall. But that said, we're doing more of that kind of stuff recently. So, for example, we had a comedian going around, whose name I've forgotten shamefully, questioning people on the street about that 22p thing you were talking about, going, the oil companies only...
I saw it, rattling a tin, trying to collect money for BP.
That's right.
Because they'd only made £32 billion profit.
That's right.
So he was trying to get it to 33 or whatever.
Help us make the rich richer.
Campaign.
So to do things like that, and also we've been doing some billboard campaigns lately, again on these profits. So these mobile billboards, you can drive around, park them outside number 10 and take a photo and whatever. So we're doing some of that. Yeah. It's getting quite good coverage, but I don't think we'll ever be, nor do we want to compete with the likes of Greenpeace, who are good friends of ours.
A little bit of vertical integration is good though, isn't it? Because you are the source of a lot of the information. So to then see that all the way through to visceral things like the billboards. Surely it's got to be a good thing to get the community engaged with what you're trying to do.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think, the billboard probably gets seen by, however many people happen to look at it when they walk by. But if it gets photographed and it's on the news or whatever, which they are being, then lots more people see it. And we tried to do it through humour. So there's this billboard campaign, and this is where I'm far too old, but it's called OnlyFans or something, some salacious site. And there are 3 billboard sites, I think most of them in the north of London, where they had a campaign, and immediately following their campaign, we put up Oily Fans with a picture of the CEO of BP, topless, talking about how much money he'd made.
Right.
And that got quite a lot of coverage.
I'm sure it did, yeah. Okay, as we wrap up, I just wanted to ask, what's been your biggest achievement, just personally for you? What's been the biggest sort of thing you've stopped, person you've caught, thing you achieved? For you personally, up to date, what are you most proud of?
Does it have to be one thing?
Yes.
I guess the creation of the organisation.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
And is there anything that's gone on in your career so far where you think that's the one that got away, or somebody who deserved to be caught and wasn't? Or of course there'll be a lot of that going on, but is there one in particular where you thought?
There probably is, and I can't think of it offhand. That's not to say that there aren't, because there are.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think.
That's part of the whole problem, isn't it, with corruption, that if they're big enough and sometimes evil enough, then they get away with it because of the laws that are created to protect them in some way.
I guess one big one was it's an organisational thing rather than a personal one. Is in the book I write about this massive corruption deal in Nigeria where Shell and the Italian oil company Eni paid $1.1 billion to this former oil minister for an oil block, and they went to court and they were acquitted. And I don't have, that was in Milan, and I think that there was very little grounds to acquit them.
It was very frustrating to read.
Extremely frustrating.
So I can't imagine what it must have been like to be involved in that.
I mean, yeah, and as I wasn't the one doing most of the work on that, it was one of my colleagues, but Simon, who's in the book, utterly frustrating. That does show the challenge because, in my opinion, they were banged to rights. They were.
So what do you think happened then? Is the law on us, or do you think somebody...
Shenanigans.
Really?
I couldn't tell you in any detail, but
yeah.
I think shenanigans.
Shenanigans.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Thank you ever so much for your time, Patrik. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up? Or anything you'd like to touch on or talk about?
I don't think so, other than perhaps mentioning the wonderful people who work for Global Witness. Yeah, absolutely. Is there anyone you want to name in particular, or anything you've got on at the moment? If I could just make a point about a general thing, actually.
Yes.
I guess going back to, your question on what am I most proud of. So I guess I'm most proud of my part as one of 3 co-founders of the organisation, because I think it was truly pioneering. And we've had so many fantastic people who joined us, who either came to us with an already illustrious track record or created one, working with us, and have gone on to become leading authorities on various subjects that we've worked on. And we've, as we were kind of spawned by the Environmental Investigation Agency, we've seen organisations created by people who used to work for us, and so the movement grows. So I think Global Witness is a force for good. It's been an awful lot of fun, and I mean that because I like getting bad guys. And I just met so many fantastic people, both in our organisation and outside of it. I couldn't wish for anything different.
Fantastic. A life lived well and to the fullest.
I'm happy.
Yeah. Wow, what an amazing interview. Patrik, again, thank you so much for your time. If you want to learn more about Global Witness, you can make donations or get involved, then I'll put links in the description below, and I'll also put a link to Patrik's book, because Very Bad People is a fantastic, if not infuriating read. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you soon.